Hello everyone, my name is Aaron Christensen. This is Horror 101 with Dr. AC, celebrating classic horror throughout history with new episodes every Friday night. Welcome to 2025 everybody. Tonight we're going to be celebrating two masterpieces of Japanese cinema. Both came out in 1964, both just celebrated a 60th anniversary. Kaneto Shindo's electrifying and stunning parable about the horrors of war, Onibaba, and Masaki Kobayashi's stunning and epic anthology effort, Kwaidan, aka Kwaidan. It's the 60th anniversary of these two classics of Japanese horror cinema, and we've got an awesome panel to chat about them with me. Let's bring everybody in, and let's say hello to Lee Price.
Honored to be here.
Christiana Benedict.
Hello. Glad to be back.
John Kitley.
Hello.
Jen, not Jennifer Olson.
Hello.
And ending the year and beginning the year, John McDevitt.
Hey everybody, great to be back.
And we're going to be chatting about Onibaba, 1964, and Kwaidan, 1964, both celebrating their 60th anniversary. Thanks for coming on the show, everybody, and welcome. I was saying backstage, I feel woefully equipped to chat about these two masterpieces of Japanese cinema, and I'm thrilled to be joined by such an awesome panel. Lee, we're going to kick things off with the discussion of Onibaba. Do you remember how you came to that movie for the first time?
It had to have been in the mid 1990s. Now I knew about it back from probably the time I was 12 years old because I had bought a book called Horror in the Cinema. I meant to bring it in with me. I had a small paperback called Horror in the Cinema. It was in 1972. And it had a picture, a picture from Onibaba that looked absolutely terrifying, showing the mask. And so that went on my must-see list of movies. And by must have been around 20, 30 years later, I actually finally got a chance to see it. So things moved slowly back in those days, and there wasn't too much access to things. So it wasn't until I had a decent specialty video store in the area that I finally received an opportunity to see it. My guess is probably 95 to 2000, somewhere in there. A long time waiting to see it.
John McDevitt, let me kick down to you. Do you remember when you first saw Onibaba?
Yes, for this one I actually do remember. This was in middle school. I don't remember exactly what year. And I just started to watch foreign films and was kind of roaming the aisles of Blockbuster and starting to spend a lot more time in the foreign section there because it was a whole new world. And I was just so excited to see especially what horror films that I could find around the world as somebody who was already a big horror fan. And I saw the cover for Onibaba, again, as Lee said, with that frightening mask. And I knew it was a film that I needed to see. And when I watched it, it just totally blew me away. It instantly became one of my favorite horror films. And the ending is one of the most memorable, I think, of any horror film.
Jen, how about you?
For me, it was mid 90s. My parents had the IFC channel on their big giant satellite dish we had back then. And late at night, they would show foreign films. And that was one of the ones I watched late night on a Saturday night. And I absolutely loved it.
Mr. Kitley.
I don't remember exactly when I saw it. I became aware of it obviously, or actually both films from Phil Hardy's Encyclopedia of Horror. Both of them have images from the film. Of course, Onibaba has the one with the lady with the mask. But I don't remember when I came across it, but I know it was one that I was always seeking out. So I'm not sure if it had gotten a VHS release or if I'd gotten a bootleg of it or when, or maybe even DVD. I don't remember, but I do remember once I finally did see it. It's one of those where the photo, as good as that photo is, the film is even better.
And Christiana, you have a terrific write-up on it on your blog from back in 2013, which I unearthed for this occasion.
I saw it at a college film society showing in 1988, 88 or 89. I get hazy that long ago. And then I bought a copy of it for my video store at the tail end of my video store because it didn't come out on VHS until I think 1998, I want to say. It was a home vision edition. I was aware of it before then because I had seen it again in Encyclopedia of Horror. Those reference books are valuable. But I mean, I lucked into it, basically. I didn't really have to look very hard for it.
Yeah, I don't remember where I heard about it for the first time. I know it's appeared in numerous reference books. It's also included in the first edition of Stephen Schneider's 1001 Movies You Have to See Before You Die. It was definitely like on my radar, but I remember watching it in the winter of 2004, and I was watching it on a relatively small TV screen, and even there, the cinematography, that black and white cinematography, just knocked me out. And it has since become kind of, if somebody's talking about cinematography, I inherently am going to bring up Onibaba at some point, because those shots of the reeds, the close-ups of the bodies, it's just an extraordinary use of black and white photography. And the fact that it's all done in natural light, or at least out in the fields and in the huts and in that practical setting, just blows me away. And when we talk about Kwaidan, I mean, they're a wonderful kind of counterpart because they're worlds apart, and yet they're absolutely examples of, incredible cinematography on their own terms.
There's a special feature on the Criterion channel associated with Onibaba that has some footage of that grass area in color. And
oh, wow.
The difference between what it looks like in black and white and what it looks like in color is astonishing. They absolutely made the right choice to do it in black and white.
I included it in the book Horror 101, the A-list of horror films, and Denise LaRusso's essay on it talks about kind of that behind the scenes. And I think a lot of that's also available on the Criterion disc, those special features of the making of, because like they had to dig like 5 different pits apparently, because they kept filling in with water.
One where she actually climbs down into the pit, they actually had to build above ground because it's filled with, they would fill with water too often.
John Kitley, would you mind giving us just the briefest of synopses?
It's a mother and daughter-in-law that are waiting for their husband to come back from war. In the meantime, to survive, they are either finding samurais that have died or helping them along their way, and then selling their equipment and swords and whatnot to a local guy for food. And it is probably one of the best portrayals of a miserable existence. The black and white again is astonishing. This film makes you sweat. You feel the heat and the misery that these two poor women are going through. Then their son's friend comes home from war by himself, finds out that their son husband has been killed, and the mother does not want the daughter-in-law to leave her for this other guy, so she stumbles across this mask and uses it to try to scare her with dire consequences.
As John pointed out, I mean, there's a lot of subtext going on. There's a lot of text going on. This is a film that has a lot to say and does it in an extraordinary way, just in terms of artistic expression. When you think about Onibaba, what jumps up for you?
You've mentioned the grass, but you haven't mentioned the music yet. The soundtrack is absolutely incredible, and something else it shares with Kwaidan. when we talk about that. Another incredible soundtrack for one of the world's best horror movie soundtracks. It's Grass and Drums, the Japanese drums, and they're just pounding away. And in the beginning, he accompanies it with really sort of primal jazz going on in the background. Then he drops in. I think that's the only time he uses it. From that point, from after that, it's mainly drums and somebody screaming in the background. Yeah, it's effective. It's really effective.
Jen, how about you?
Well, like you said, the grass, the cinematography, it's beautiful. The black and white, even though it didn't need it, like at that time, color was around it. They chose black and white and I understand why. Like Christiane said, I saw the special feature on the Criterion where it showed the grass in color, and then they showed the black and white. Total difference. I totally understand why he went black and white.
Mm-hmm.
And also the soundtrack when she's running to the guy, and he used doves cooing as part of the soundtrack, and I just absolutely loved that.
And the he in question, who we haven't mentioned yet, but Kaneto Shindo is our writer, director, art director, and kind of visionary behind the project, and future husband of our lead actress, Nobuko Katoa.
For me, it's the film's depiction of humans as animals.
Yes.
And also the exploration of the very human denial that we are animals. And it's just a through line through the entire film, from the opening sequence to the very end. And it is just so stunning and truly horrifying.
The poverty has brought them to this state. I mean, we don't even, the mother and the daughter don't even speak. They murder these two samurai. They drag their bodies to the pit. They throw them in. Not a word has been spoken.
Yeah.
They go in, they start stuffing handfuls of rice into their mouth. This is their existence. They don't need to speak. And they have been kind of brought down to that animal level.
I totally agree about the opening sequence. I mean, it's just a depiction of these two people who are living the most primal existence. It's also stunning the way they just collapse in exhaustion after all of that work, after the hunting. And after the ravenous eating. Such a powerful signal that these people are already kind of reduced to wild animals.
One of the things that really strikes me is the way that and I wrote about this, is the way that it occupies recognizable archetypes. I think I described this as sort of the missing link between I Walked with a Zombie and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. The last time I watched it, I mean, I was really struck by how much this resembles the Sawney Bean myth. Well, in the Sawney Bean myth, they're cannibals, but you have this group of murderers out there, waylaying the unwary who have wandered off the beaten track. And in this case, it's a little bit more complicated than that because, of course, you have the backdrop of war. I also really love the way that it depicts warfare, which is to say it's from the point of view of the people on the sidelines. So it's like way off in the distance most of the time. I mean, the one real fight that we see between soldiers, there's just two of them, is on the other side of the marsh, and they just sort of fight at a distance from our characters until they're not at a distance from the characters, at which point the three main characters, basically jump into the water and murder them. It's very oblique. The other thing that strikes me every time I see the film is how expressive that mask is. And I know that it's a no theater thing, because, I mean, the mask itself is a hanya, which is a mask used in no theater to denote a vengeful or demonic woman. And in theater, they use lighting to, give the mask expressions, and they do the exact same thing in this movie.
We'll just go ahead and talk about the mask really quick because it was famously repurposed, at least inspired, the Pazuzu image for William Friedkin's The Exorcist. When you see those two, and you're like, oh, that's the line between those two. If we talk about the women, neither character is named. They are the mother and then the wife. There's something reductive about that, and I think that's being done purposefully. But also there's that fear of being separated. She's hanging on to her daughter-in-law, and we never hear about what happened to her husband. What happened to the mother's husband, like where the father of her son went to. We can maybe assume that he went off to war. We don't know, but the men are just out of the picture on so many levels. And then it really is focusing on these two women who have become, like you said, Christiana, they're archetypes. They are mother, they are wife, they are lover, etc.
Their remarks about war, the son's friend that comes back, Hachi, mentions or makes the point that it's just governments fighting, and we're the casualties. That, I mean, and it strikes too at any decade of any time that there's war, it's the same thing. So there's a very powerful message there. But I also think, I don't want to disagree with everybody's comments about that they've reduced themselves to animals. I think there is a last grasp of hope holding onto their humanity, because the daughter-in-law is going to Hachi for companionship, for love. So there is still that hope of having a normal life, so to speak, or what they can. And then the mother doesn't want her to leave because she doesn't want to be alone. I mean, I understand the animal aspect of it because they're just trying to survive. And when they see that dog run through, it's food. But I do think there's a sense of humanity left in them, which to me makes the story even more tragic, because they have a miserable existence to begin with, and now something comes back that is going to make it even worse.
I'm glad you brought that up, actually, because what is it that makes us human? What is it that does, quote, elevate us from the animals? At the bottom of it, we are animals as well. When she's running, and every time she goes to meet Hachi, she is running full tilt. That idea of the animalistic, that there's that drive. It's not cerebral at all. It's coming from a deeper place. But I think that's the thing. Like, I think they are trying to hang on to their humanity in spite of the circumstances.
I think the movie has tremendous respect for the two women as surviving in a time of extraordinary difficulty. If they weren't doing this, they would be dead.
They kind of strike me as a rebuke to the sort of noble suffering of women in, say, movies by Kenji Mizoguchi, like The Sisters of the Gaion or Osaka Elegy, in which, the women in those films are, reduced to sex work in the Ginza and suffer nobly for their families, only to have, no reward for it. This film, I think, unromanticizes that. It deconstructs the romantic image of that, and it is significant too that Kaneto Shindo started his career working for Kenji Mizoguchi. Right. So there is a line of descent there, and that was actually very much in the water of the Japanese New Wave, because there are other films like that. I mean, we mentioned Backstage, Woman of the Dunes, which is like that. There's also Insect Woman by Shohei Imamura, and these are films that are very similar to Onibaba insofar as you say, this is not romantic. This is just the brute necessity of staying alive in hard times.
Well, and if we could talk about kind of the matter-of-factness of that, the nudity that is presented here, it's not done in an exploitative way. It's done so matter-of-fact, like the mother just comes out with her smock on with one breast exposed. She's not doing that to be alluring, and I don't think it is for a male gaze. I think it is simply, this is how we get through life. And the reason they are laying in bed naked is because it's friggin' hot and you can't take off another layer. Like, this is what we've got. So I love how kind of matter of fact it seems, because it manages to do both things. It manages to have nudity for an audience that might be desiring that might be an appeal, but it also is done in a not very sexy way. And I really like that it manages to straddle that line.
On the Criterion extras, they have a lot of 8mm or Super 8 footage that was done behind the scenes, I think, by the actor who played Hachi. Everybody is topless. I mean, it's so hot. You can see them. Everybody is sweating out there. And in the interviews they have, it describes about all the insects out there. It's just uncomfortable as anything, and they're sweating and they're hot out there. None of the men are wearing shirts. They're all just stripped down to what the only thing that's going to be comfortable in this pretty difficult environment.
I think it would be miserable, because it's got to be humid too, being in that marsh, and if it was that hot and the insects, like, Yeah, I'd probably be walking around topless too if no one was around, you know?
When it's that hot and uncomfortable, I don't think sex is on people's minds. They're just
No.
like, I just got to get through the day here. Get
Right.
away from me.
And we do see quite a lot of irritation in the characters of the mother and the daughter-in-law, and maybe much of it is authentic. Maybe they're not acting. They might
Yeah,
really be
right.
miserable in that filming circumstance.
Oh yeah, I think that has to add to their performance, just being miserable in the filming.
I kind of love that Shindo just brought everybody out there for 3 months in the middle of nowhere, in this little prefabbed housing that they were living in a small community where they could do some pretty good collaborating together. So a nice way to make a film.
And if they left, they wouldn't get paid.
Yeah. You're all indentured servants until this thing is done. So, and yeah, it had become kind of a little commune / community of just living out there. You get up, you go to work, you go back, but you don't ever leave that space. You don't ever leave that place of discomfort. And I think it really feeds into the film. The mother, as she's worried about the daughter-in-law leaving her, she encounters a samurai who's wearing the mask initially. And he appears as a very mysterious and regal figure, perhaps a representation of war or those who are leading war. When she takes the mask off of him, what is revealed but the scarred face that brings to mind the victims of the atomic bomb in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I mean, Shindo, I think, is making a very clear statement about how he feels about war and those who are stigmatized and or left behind by war.
It does give you a really good example of classes, of the way he talks down to her and threatening her. I mean, it is a subclass of humans. They're there to serve, and she's even thinking, well, if I do this for you, you're going to kill me anyway. In Japan at that time, how society was in those kind of different classes of, lowly servants or half human, so to speak, according to the samurai.
There's a thread of films around that time period that are very much interested in sort of dismantling the idea that the samurai were noble. If Akira Kurosawa was the John Ford of the samurai movie, then you have a half a dozen other filmmakers in the 1960s who were your Robert Aldrich's and your Sergio Leone's.
Just there to demystify it all.
Just to demystify. There's a film, Kill, by Kihachi Akamoto, that has this running gag where the samurai do something completely awful, and the main character, played by Tatsuya Nakadai, keeps telling this guy, this kid that admires the samurai, he says, "Now do you see what samurai are like?" And I think you get that. Yeah, I think you get that here. And of course, Kaneto Shindo was a veteran of World War II, and he very much, I think, in his films views the samurai class, who were the class that started World War II, by the way, as being completely full of shit and being a complete disaster to anybody that's around the samurai who aren't samurai.
For a really nasty portrait of samurai, the movie that Shindo did after this, Kuroneko,
Oh yeah,
it really begins with one nasty scene. The samurai don't come off well in that movie.
Oh, they don't.
Kuroneko, and that's also known as Black Cat, or is that a different?
Correct.
Movie?
Yes,
Nope,
that's
same
the
one.
one.
That reunited him with his cinematographer, Kiyomi Kuroda. Coming back around to the Demon Mask, is this a horror film? I've had people question, like whether it deserves to be included in this book or that book, because there's not a lot of supernatural, and while there is murder and things like that, it's not done in a quote scary way. What are people's thoughts about its inclusion as a horror film? Do you feel like it fits, or is it one that, as I've often been accused of, that gets included because I want you to see this movie, and if I have to call it a horror movie, I will?
Well, it definitely teases ideas of the supernatural. The mysterious hole in the middle of the field of reeds almost has a supernatural character to it. And of course, the mask and the theorizing that the rain might have cemented this mask to the mother's face as a supernatural event, and just the way that this mask has the same effect on these two people that we see wear it. And also just kind of the horror of their experience, a story of these people living in squalor and depravity and the horrible things that they do to each other. And I agree with Lee that there is something very understandable about it, because there is sort of a survival mechanism that's taking over. These people very well might die if they don't resort to these measures. But yeah, it's definitely kind of looking at the very arguably ugly things that human beings can do.
It's definitely about the horrors of war, the ugly things that people do during war to survive. And then the demon mask itself, I mean, that woman believed it was a demon coming after her for her sins, you know? It haunted her, and the ending alone.
Anybody who like pushes back, I'm like, have you seen the ending? Because I'm feeling pretty broken up at that point.
I would call it horror for a lot of I mean, everything that everybody's mentioned, the horrors of war. I always go back to the intent of the filmmaker. And while not throughout the entire film, there are parts of it that he is intending to scare the audience. And with what the mother-in-law is trying to do to the daughter-in-law is obviously to scare her for whatever reasons. The supernatural element for the mask depends on how you want to read it. Could be there, maybe it's not there. It could be the rain that affected it, like they say in the film, or it could be the mask shows the underneath the true person, the true essence of the person. Meaning that if you're a good person, you're not going to have an issue with it. But if you are a demon inside, it's going to come through. So it depends on how you want to take it.
There's a horror trope in that, the idea of a mask that won't come off, you know, like that, that just immediately conjures up an EC Comics type of scenario where it's like you put on the mask to scare somebody and then you become that thing. For me, it's less of an argument that I engage in much these days, but I figured I'd throw it out there to see what other people's interpretations were.
Well, I mean, if you're gonna police the boundary of horror, oh yeah, Lee knows what's coming. If you're not careful, the horror as a genre evaporates if you police it too carefully. Because you have, on one hand, you have dark fantasy, and then on the other hand, you have psychological suspense. And where is the boundary? It seems to me that there is a horror genre, obviously. And I would imagine that everybody here would agree with me. I think that there's a lot of overlap. I mean, Psycho has no supernatural elements to it. It's absolutely a horror movie. Right. Ditto the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. The Silence of the Lambs, I think, does have a supernatural element.
But that's another episode.
But that's another episode. So I think this is absolutely a horror movie.
I agree, 100% horror. Is it folk horror? Now, I think it is. This is about as pure.
Well, we're going to come back to that. We're going to come back to that with the next film, I think.
For sure.
Probably.
Yeah. Yeah. I have folk horror question mark written in my notes. What is inclusive? I mean, this is about, you know, the long held beliefs, also kind of a removed from polite society, quote, civilization, and that those beliefs are allowed to foster and grow. So I think there's an argument to be made for being folk horror.
Well, it is based on a Buddhist fairy tale that is completely the opposite of what this film actually is. It's a tale designed to enforce the chastity of women, and that's just not what this film is about at all.
Well, and as we switch over to Kwaidan, this is another one where I think horror fans may be a little confused as to what movie they wandered into when they see the running time, and second, when they go, yes, it's an anthology, but it's not an anthology film that has the kind of stingers that we're used to. It doesn't have the kind of Twilight Zone zing, and the episodes are, understandably longer. There's 4 of them over the course of 3 hours. But it's directed by Masaki Kobayashi. I got it from the library as part of their foreign film selection and was just transfixed by it. Every time, including this time, I think, I really should break this up. I really shouldn't, I should appreciate each one on its own. And I just end up letting the whole thing just wash over me. And I end up sitting there for 3 hours and I go, wow, that was a really, really rich meal. And I feel ill-equipped to talk about it, but I know I'm in the presence of greatness. And I feel that way watching Onibaba, and I feel that way watching Kwaidan. Mr. Kitley, let's kick things off. How did you come to Kwaidan for the first time?
I came about knowing about it from the Phil Hardy book, but in this one I do remember finding somewhat close to me. There was a Laserdisc store, QED Laser, and they had the Laserdisc for Kwaidan, and that was the first time I had ever seen any sort of release for that. So that was one of my immediate rentals to finally see this film. I knew the running time somewhere in my head, but didn't realize it. And when I hit play and realized I think it was on a couple of different discs. It's a long movie. The stories are not action packed. So be fair warned for viewers that are not used to Japanese cinema. It is not a fast paced story. None of them are. But the thing that I immediately loved about it was the cinematography, the settings, the stages that they built, and that the fact that it does move that slow. These are traditional ghost stories, but you get a ghost story from a different country and a different era that, for me personally, growing up in here in the US, you don't see those, you don't understand those. So it was nice to see a different experience from a different country. I do remember watching Tales from the Dark Side, the movie, and going, hey, this looks really familiar.
Lee, how about you?
It's the same stories with Onibaba. I knew it from the time I was 12. It was also in that book, Horror in the Cinema. It's Ivan Butler, I think, was the author. And I wanted to see it ever since, but I didn't get to see it until I was in my mid-30s. And I guess it sounded, if the home vision video for Onibaba came out in 1998. It was probably right around that same time. I do remember that in the case of both movies, this was a time when 90% of the movies in the video store were pan and scan, and these movies were not. And I can't even imagine what a horrible experience that would be if either of these were touched that way.
Yeah.
Because both of them just have such masterful use of the widescreen. But I just remember the widescreen, the color right from the beginning. Immediately in love with the look of the whole thing, the look and sound of it.
Jen.
I came across it in the early 2000s. Back then, I would go every Sunday to Borders store, get some coffee and go shopping and buy some books and some movies. And I came across a DVD of it, and something just drew me to it, and I bought it and watched it that day, and I fell in love with it.
Wow. Yeah, so you didn't know anything about it.
No, I just read what it was about on the back, and I was all into Asian films at the time, and I was like, heck yeah, this sounds great. I didn't notice the runtime, but at the time, the person I was seeing, they fell asleep after like the first story. I watched the rest of it, but
Good job. Christiana.
Well, I knew elements of Kwaidan before I ever saw the film because I had seen Cosmos had the hiki crabs in it as an example of natural selection, and related to the tale of the Hiki clan, where fishermen would view taking the hiki crabs that look like samurai as bad luck and throw them back. As a result, they came to dominate the ecosystem. And I think I had seen Tales from the Dark Side, the movie, before I had actually seen Kwaidan. I saw it for the first time when we bought it for the video store I used to run. And I knew what the running time was before I started watching it because it was on VHS. It was the home vision edition that Lee was talking about, which was on 2 tapes, which means that it was a brick. I was just completely floored by it. It was the second film by Kobayashi that I had seen. The first one was Hara-Kiri. And that film had blown me away as well. So I had an inkling that it would be good. I didn't realize it was going to be what it was.
John McDevitt.
I don't remember exactly the first time I saw this one, but it was likely when I was going down one of my many rabbit holes to watch more anthology movies, to dig up more anthology films that I hadn't seen before, because it's one of my favorite subgenres of cinema. I'm loving all of the call-outs to Tales from the Dark Side, the movie, because it's so true that final segment in that film is very much inspired by one of the segments in Kwaidan. I was really stunned by it. I mean, it sort of lives in the same place in my heart as The Company of Wolves, in part because of that leaning into the artificiality of the set design and just, I don't know, the fantastical atmosphere of it. Super excited to be chatting with you all about it.
I'll just rattle off the segments. We won't go into each one because then this podcast would be as long as the film itself. But we have The Black Hair, Woman of the Snow, Hoichi the Earless, and In a Cup of Tea. As John Kitley pointed out, they each kind of deal with a different kind of ghost. It isn't the same thing over and over again, but the opulence of the production design is present. And what you just said, John McDevitt, the artificiality, the theatricality, there's not a sense of realism here, but that's kind of what lends the sense of wonder is that they built these sets and you have a little, pond in the middle of it and you have them, boating their way down a, ocean. And all of that just kind of calls to mind for me, like, this is artistry. This is somebody using a different way of storytelling because film had been so much about reality, like here's the reality of it. And here, in fact, is the opposite of that. It's just a different vein of storytelling.
Something else I thought about in this viewing was, in a way, how much it reminds me of Creepshow and feels like a precursor to Creepshow, not just as a horror anthology film, but sort of what Creepshow does with American comics and kind of animating them, bringing them to life. I think Kwaidan is doing with Japanese paintings. One of the scenes that really stood out on this viewing was the naval battle and the intercutting of that scene as paintings and that scene acted with real actors, and the smoke that overlays both and kind of the phasing from one to the other.
Lee?
We've already covered the 4 stories, so I'm going to jump all the way to the beginning. We haven't covered them yet, but I didn't want to miss the credit scene because it is so gorgeous. It's one of the most gorgeous credit scenes I've ever seen, with the ink dissolving in the water. And I could just, for an experimental film, I can watch that endlessly. It's so beautiful. Plus, it's working with the soundtrack as well, which is equally experimental. You just have the bells, which are not exactly rhythmic. They're coming in at unexpected moments, and just beautifully conceived and done. So I just wanted to do a little call out to the opening credits before we get into the 4 stories.
Sure. And it's fun that this is coming out of Toho, the same company that is producing a lot of Akira Kurosawa's art house films. And Ghidorah, the three-headed monster, and Godzilla vs. Mothra both came out from Toho the same year, 1964. What a wonderful year. Christiana, what are some moments that jump out for you?
This movie has my favorite special effect in history, in the history of movies. And it's interesting because most of the special effects in this movie are really just really low tech. It's lap dissolves or jump cuts or just changing the lighting. And my favorite special effect is in the 3rd segment. It's in Hoichi the Earless, where they've drawn the holy text on this poor blind singer, but they forgot to draw it on his ears.
Yep.
When the ghost arrives to take Hoichi to his nightly recitation of the song of the Hiki clan, the ghost can't see him except for his ears, and there's this one shot where it switches from what the real world is, or the set of realities that's being presented as the real world. Nothing is real in this film. and it suddenly turns into ghost vision, and you just see his ears hovering there in the air, and I just love that shot.
Yep.
It does it in one shot, doesn't it?
It does it in one shot. It does it in one shot. And it's just like, whoa, that's just magic.
Well, and that image of Hoichi covered in the script is so striking. And you watch it kind of like happening in stages, but watching it slowly cover his body.
Yeah.
And of course, if you've been paying attention to the title, you know, like you could see his ears have not been painted. And you're like, no, wait, right there. You missed a
It's the
spot.
most
You missed two
obvious
spots.
spot.
Jen, what are some highlights for you?
Well, the Woman of the Snow is my favorite segment of them. The backdrop, how it looks like eyes,
All the
in the
eyes
sky and
floating in the sky.
Oh, and it shows the nighttime with the woods, and oh, I love that. That it's so beautiful. That's my favorite.
I think it's my favorite too. And I love how those eyes give you the feeling that these characters are always in the presence of spirits. They're always being watched. And of course, you know, he discovers that indeed he always is.
And I don't know if that actress was famous or if we're not supposed to notice that, you know, like that is the woman in the snow that, you know, that he later meets, or if it's just, it's a fairy tale and we accept it.
The lighting's different.
Yeah. She's
She
not
has
wearing
eyebrows.
blue
I
lights.
don't
Yeah,
know.
exactly.
Yes. It's not as cold.
Very happy
Yeah.
suspension of disbelief for me.
Yeah. I mean, you kind of have to, but when the reveal happens, there is that sense of kind of Jekyll and Hyde where just the lighting changes and she is absolutely not his wife anymore. She is the woman of the snow. John Kitley, some favorite images?
There's a lot of them in here.
There are.
I mean, the face in the cup of tea, the haunting there. What I find interesting that for a society that male dominated, like we talked about how noble the samurai technically really weren't. There's always in their ghost films, they show how shit the men are. The ghosts come back to get them for it, time and time again. And this film has that in a few of the stories. That you're always going to get, it's always going to come back to haunt you, literally.
Mhm.
But it's funny that is the constant theme in a lot of their horror films with the ghosts. They come back to right a wrong that someone had been done to, and it's usually a female character. But in this one, and it's hard to recommend this one to people because unless you're an experienced or a diehard cinephile, when you tell someone to watch a 3-hour movie, one that is not action packed, you really have to convince them just sit back and enjoy the scenery, the story, the acting, because it is really worth it. And it's great to see these performed on a stage, technically, like different segments. And I do recommend it to people to watch them segment by segment, or watch the first two, come back the next day and watch the last two. But it is some very impressive cinema.
I mean, they put an intermission in there. I mean, it's right there. Take a break, everybody. John McDevitt.
So shifting from imagery to sound, the score of this film is really interesting too, just as interesting as the one in Onibaba. Some of the most intense scenes in this film are just accompanied by those sounds of tearing and scratching, and it's so unpredictable, and it doesn't really match what you're seeing on screen, but adds to the unnerving quality of just watching these most horrific events happen in the film.
Our composer is Toru Takamitsu. He also did Women in the Dunes that same year, which, as Christiana pointed out, is a terrific film. It's not a horror film. I think horror fans will definitely enjoy it, as anybody else who enjoys Japanese cinema. A couple people have voiced their favorite or their preference for a certain episode. How do we feel about the running order? Does the running order fit?
I do like it, because I think that it eases us in with the simplest of the stories with the long black hair. And then the big center of the film, the longest story, is the third one. And then the last one is another short, snappy one. There's sort of a wave structure. You start small and build and then come back down.
I could live in the middle two forever. That's just that's the world I want to live in, the world of the snow, or Koichi the Fearless. Those are incredible. I love those two episodes. The first one, black hair, I like nearly as much. It's great. And then the last one is always a bit of a letdown for me. I just that's one that isn't quite it just doesn't quite reach me at the same level. And every time I hope that this time it's going to break through for me and for me fully.
I had a little bit of an epiphany with that one this time because I watched it a couple of days ago, and I realized that I've always felt the same way that you do, Lee, about that segment. And I realized that the reason that I feel that way is because I've always watched the damn film in one sitting.
Yep.
And it's always really late at night when I get to that last segment, and I'm only half awake for it almost every time I see it. This time I watched it in pieces. The last segment, it struck me as being like the roots of sort of the Ring style of Japanese horror. You have a ghost that's climbing out of something. You have an object, an ordinary object that's a portal to another world. And I don't think I ever really noticed that before.
I like the clock. I like the clock very much. That's the highlight of it for me. So I do like the portal part.
Yeah, and the author really does appear to be reaching out of the pot at the end.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And I like the fact that at the end, it's presented as an unfinished story. It is a story that will continue to go on in your mind. And so I think it does kind of have to be the last one because it wants to send you out with that idea of continuing to tell your story and think about things beyond that. But it also feels very much like, I mean, Twilight Zone was an entity at that point. It feels to me like the most like a Twilight Zone episode, just in terms of length, in terms of the twist, like all of that feels very kind of Rod Serling, kind of to your point, Christiane. It feels more modern in a way that the others feel more elegaic.
I wanted to respond to something that John Kitley said back a little bit ago about the black hair episode and the whole angry ghost thing going on here, because the strange thing about that episode is it's not the story. It's not the Lafcadio Hearn story, the ghost story that they were drawing from, because the original story there was not an angry ghost at all. It's called The Reconciliation, and it's about the man returning and having a very positive experience with the ghost. And I mean, one reason for not doing that is it ends very similar. It's very similar to Yugetsu. So it's kind of been done. But it's a very sweet, romantic story.
That's kind of a pan-Asian sort of story structure. I mean, you mentioned Yugetsu. It's also Nong Nok, the Taiga story. It's a familiar story structure from across Asia.
But they went with the angry ghost this time. That's another good.
Well, they got to get people in the seats.
But I also find the Hyochi one is different because it's not. He has entranced these dead soldiers, these ghosts, by his fantastic song and storytelling, that they want to have him keep redoing this and retelling it. It's a little bit different than what, like I had said before, the angry ghost stuff. Granted, when they can't find him, things don't go well for them, but it's a little bit different than the typical story that we see in a lot of these.
I had this really weird thought this time watching it with Hoichi doing his recitation performance. Is this the way the Iliad was done? Is this the way the Odyssey was done? It may be the closest we have to a surviving art form that really sort of captures an ancient way of telling stories in a poetic fashion. And that just I want to dive into that a bit deeper and find out if this particular art form does have truly ancient roots.
If you think about most ghost stories, or hauntings, there is something that has caused the ghost to be at unrest, and something needs to occur for them to move through the veil and to the other side. I love the fact that, you have this whole cadre of ghosts who are like, here's what we need. We need you to give us a concert, and it's going to be a couple days long. But once you give us that, we're probably going to be good to go. But they enjoy it so much that they can't let go. We've seen that before where they get addicted to the humanity, the being able to enjoy those things that make us human, such as entertainment. And there's something about that struck me this time, that all these ghosts come together in a community to experience this thing that only a human can provide.
Plus, these are the stories of their great battle. As warriors, that is their prime. That is what they lived for and died for. This is how they're becoming alive again, rehearing their great battle once again. So yeah, they don't want it to end. They want to keep it going because it brings them back to their humanity when they were alive.
The scene where all of the Hiki ghosts turn into tombstones reminds me of the scene in Psychomania where all the ghost demon cyclists turn into standing stones, and you said, well, it's all folklore.
Yeah,
which of course it is, because I mean, a lot of the stories that Hearn collected, I mean, he didn't write them. They were stories that were out there as folk tales. He was, the Brothers Grimm.
There's a novel, Kwaidan, Yoko Mizuki. Lafcadio Hearn is the one who created the stories, and then they were adapted for the screen by another writer. But he was somebody who had grown up, I forget where he grew up, but
he was born in Greece.
Okay, that's right.
But to Irish parents, and he lived in the United States, and then he retired to Japan and became a Japanese citizen.
Yeah. It's a fascinating story. So as you're doing your deep dives on Wikipedia, finding out about this film, definitely do those little sidebars, because it's really an incredible story behind the story, including Masaki Kobayashi, because his story with Toho is this, because this was the third of his 3 films with them.
Yeah.
Hara-Kiri being one of them.
It's really out of character for him too at that point in his career, because he started out as a social realist. I mean, you look at a film like the Human Condition films, or We Own You, which is about corruption in baseball. I mean, they're all very, very realistic, very gritty sort of moral tales. And this is, I remember reading one of Donald Ritchie's books about Japanese cinema, and he said that there were certain Japanese filmmakers whose careers looked like the history of Japanese cinema running in reverse. And this sort of reminds me of that, because you have the social realist turning into the no theater impresario.
What you have here too is Kobayashi, that this is a labor of love for him, that he's doing this. You took the Lafcadio Hearn story up only to a certain point. Hearn was a professor at one of the universities there, and he became the mentor to the main professor who took Kobayashi through his university years. It was his favorite professor, Aizu Yaichi. Kobayashi loved Japanese art and the history of art. And all of a sudden, he had this idea to do a movie that wasn't really indulging his love for horror so much as his love for art, which is just all over it. And he did it, and he said it. He did it as an homage to his mentor, his art professor back at the university.
I read somewhere that they ran out of money about 3/4 of the way through, and so he had to mortgage his house in order to finish the film. The film ended up being pretty successful on a critical level. I don't know about its commercial prospects, but it won a special jury prize at the Cannes Film Festival, as well as being nominated for the Foreign Language Oscar. So it definitely, reached some prestige, especially in a pretty meeting some stiff competition from Japan that same year.
Both Onibaba and Kwaidan are both coming out in you were saying 1964 is a great year for the Japanese industry, but it's also the studios are in really rapid change at that moment. They're running around 10 years behind the United States, I think, in their television panic around this time. And they're slashing budgets. So you've got 2 movies where the directors have to put up money in order to do the movie.
Right.
So there was a lot of risk for those directors, but they were moving towards. They were kind of wondering if they could do that American model, which worked for some actors and some directors and didn't for others. where you go into independent production. And so
Well-
these movies were released by Toho, but a lot of it seems to be being produced.
Being created independently and
Yeah.
distributed.
It'll be distributed by Toho.
Yeah.
But
Kaneto Shindo had formed his own production company for Onibaba, and Kobayashi was on the verge of forming a production company with Kazuki Kinoshita and Kan Ichikawa and Akira Kurosawa. They called themselves the Four Knights. Wound up only producing one movie.
Sounds very similar to the late 60s, early 70s in Hollywood, where the studios didn't know what to do. And suddenly the independents were just coming up with stuff and going, well, what about this? What about this? What about this? And you get such a sense of creativity and risk taking.
That is one of the enduring influences of Onibaba is that, I mean, you can point to Onibaba and say, this is where the Japanese studio system got the idea to start making the pink films of the 70s. Because it's very much in that sort of erotic grotesque.
Well, kind of building off of what Christiana just said, another scene that I wanted to talk about from Onibaba is when Hachi sort of has the idea for the first time of having sex with the daughter-in-law. And when he starts kind of going back to his hut, he is just writhing, he's thrashing in the reeds, completely out of control. It was such a striking moment.
And that scene where the mother sees the couple making love and you just see her burning inside as well, like that frustration and the recognizing that she is still human and she does still have that desire. It called to mind X, the Ty West film, where the older Pearl is like, I'm still here. I'm still alive. I'm still a human. And I don't get to participate in that part of humanity anymore.
Some additional thoughts about Kwaidan. And I think that collectively we pronounced the title maybe 4 different ways over the course of this episode.
Yeah, the pronunciation of Kwaidan with the W is actually an archaic form.
Gotcha.
And Kwaidan is basically also becoming an archaic form as well, and they both mean ghost story.
Right.
And these days they just use Hora, Hora. I don't know what the kanji is. I don't do the kanji, but Kaidan and Kwaidan are like, it's like ye old curiosity shop where old is spelled with an E.
I do think that it has a significant level of familiarity, at least for me, and I expect also for many modern audiences in terms of the stories it tells, the story beats, the twists at the end. I don't think it's so alien compared to modern horror stories or weird tales. There's the sort of setting up of like a small vignette with its own set of rules, and most of the tales in the film sort of find where the crack is, where something devastating can happen, and then the main character experiences that point of no return. Most of the stories feel very Twilight Zone-esque to me, and they're gimmicky in a similar way too, and not in a bad way at all. Just the kind of writing of the text on the man's body and forgetting the ears, the kind of rapid aging of the husband in the first segment when he goes back to his wife, and making the mistake of telling somebody what you saw in the snowstorm. Those points of no return feel so familiar from so many other genre stories that have come since.
We haven't talked as much about Black Hair, but there was something when our samurai who has left his wife behind because he feels he's meant for better things, and goes off and romances a noblewoman and becomes a high-ranking samurai. When he was doing his riding stunts and he's doing his arrow shooting, it struck me like, wait, people actually learn how to do that. like you have to learn how to shoot a bow and arrow and hit things while riding a horse. That's a skill set I have never even thought about trying to pick up. It is that sense of you have aspired to something, you've achieved something, and then you realize that it isn't what you wanted. And I think that is kind of what you're talking about, John, that it's that sense of fairy tale, that sense of tragedy, that sense of realization. I think it's interesting that he refers to his new wife as cold, but he's the one who's rejecting her. Like she comes to him at his bedside and, he does that kind of push away with his hand and she's just, completely demoralized by it.
Attacks the heck out of him with that fan too.
But yeah, the ending where he gets attacked by the hare. Well, before the very ending, but I mean, when he comes back and has that moment of reconciliation, and it is very sweet, but then it flips, and I was like, oh, so wait, was the ghost not okay with this and was luring him in, or was it just to have that one moment?
I kind of thought that it was luring him in, saying,
Okay.
it's okay. It's okay. I forgive you. Sure. Let's have this one night. And then she wasn't okay. I wouldn't be okay. I would be vengeful. That's just me though.
They make really great use of the hair prop as well, like especially when it seems to be pulsing and just very subtly writhing when it's still on the top of the blanket. And it also made me think of In Fabric and the dress that's kind of floating at people to kill them. Not the same as hair, but if you watch In Fabric, just the experience of watching hair fly at somebody to kill them and a sort of silky dress fly at somebody to kill them, it's quite similar.
That's Peter Strickland's film In Fabric. We'll circle back around to our Japanese 1964 celebration. Final thoughts on either, both of the films. And thank you all for bringing your expertise and your enthusiasm. It's been a fun conversation. John Kitley.
If people listening out there or watching this have not seen them, I would highly recommend it, especially Onibaba, because it's shorter. They both need to be seen. And again, Onibaba is one of those that I always love to push on people that don't like black and white cinema. I think that it is a prime example that it's one of the more striking black and white films out there.
Christiana.
I mean, I watched both of them in anticipation of this. I mean, I'm really familiar with both of those films, but I haven't watched either of them in a decade. I was struck by how much both films sort of matriculate through the genre and through the culture. I mean, the image of Hoichi being marked with the holy text all over his body is repeated in Conan the Barbarian and Peter Greenaway's The Pillow Book, and it's really, really, I mean, it's a striking image. They're both very influential, and if you're familiar with the horror genre after both of them, you'll see where a lot of the horror genre comes from in subsequent years.
And actually, before I jump over to you, Lee, I think that you bring up a good point, Christian, that these are films that benefit from repeat viewings and taking time in between those viewings and accumulating more horror and cinema knowledge, so that when you come back around to them, you are seeing them through very different eyes. Because I think these films mature in the same way that as we continue to grow as cinema goers, the dividends pay off higher and higher each time.
Oh, and the other thing that I would say about this is if you do take a chance on both of these films, explore the filmographies of both of these directors, particularly Kaneto Shindo's career as a screenwriter, because he only directed 49 films, but he wrote 250.
Yeah. I was looking at his credits. I was like, wow, this guy was working. Yeah,
and some of those are for very important directors, because he wrote films for Yasuzo Masamura and Seijun Suzuki, and it's just, I mean, he's very key to the way that the Japanese New Wave looks, and so too is Masaki Kobayashi. I mean, I'm really happy that with the availability of his films over the last decade or so expanding, that he's starting to be spoken of in the same breath with, Akira Kurosawa or Ozu or Mizoguchi. I mean, there are a lot of really great Japanese filmmakers, and traditionally Western critics have only stayed with like the big three, and I'm happy to see them like expanding to the big four or maybe the big six.
Lee.
Two extraordinarily great directors at the peak of their form, working with the best of collaborators they could ever ask for. Just wonderful movies. I can watch these anytime. One thing I didn't bring up earlier that I just wanted to mention about both movies, and something I've seen in other Japanese movies too, and I always love, they have the best rain scenes over there. Suddenly there's a monsoon going on and it's just the rain slashing across the screen, and both movies go with that. Were very important scenes.
The good news is that those aren't actually special effects, that's just what happened that day. They're just like, yep, it's monsoon season. Here we go.
Yeah, I think that may be the truth with Onibaba, that it started raining and they went out and filmed the scene in the middle of it.
I believe that.
They just make love in the field now as the rain comes down.
Come on, everybody, get up. We got stuff to do. John McDevitt.
Well, this has been a delightful double feature. I love the contrast between the kind of earthiness and griminess of Onibaba and its richness of black and white cinematography next to the richness of color and the sort of leaning into artifice in Kwaidan. They're both remarkable horror films, and I never thought to watch them together before, and it was a joy.
And Jen.
For those watching that have not watched these, definitely start with Onibaba first. Kwaidan, you need to be in a certain mood to watch it, especially if you do it the whole way through. You just need to be able to pay attention and watch. It's not something you can have on while you're on your phone and just kind of listen to it. No, you need to pay attention and watch. They're pieces of art.
Yeah, I would say that's true of both films, is that this is one to set your phone off to the side, and if at all possible, watch on the biggest screen possible with the best sound you can have, because
lights off.
Yeah, as Lee
in
as
a
Lee
theater,
out,
best would be best.
I've never seen either of these in a theater, and I'm dying for that opportunity, because as Lee said, like both of them, both sound and vision are extraordinary, and so much time went into them. We didn't mention this, but with Kwaidan, the director worked with the composer for an extended amount of time, making sure that it was just the way they wanted it. They understood that you have these incredibly striking visuals, they have to have the counterpoint in terms of the musicality. And Onibaba, I love how much drive and pause we get with the music. They're both just extraordinary pieces of cinema. It was so interesting to me, when I was putting this panel together, the idea that both these films came out in 1964. They don't feel like they belong in the same universe, and yet here they are. They're playing perhaps down the street from one another, and they are worlds apart, and both are worlds that I recommend everybody visit as soon as possible and as often as possible. Thank you all so much. This was an incredible conversation, and thanks for the opportunity to commune with folks immediately after watching them. I don't think I'd had that chance before. Usually I'm watching, I'm like, now who's seen Onibaba recently? Nobody. Okay, great. Looking forward to having you all again very soon. Thanks for kicking off 2025 in style. And until next time, keep searching, keep exploring, and keep sharing the scare.